I don't know about you, but I found that the readings for today come as a breath of fresh air in the current ongoing pandemic, lockdown, and negative news that we hear. We continue to experience the weight of the consequences of the lockdown and the burden that it is placing on our country, on our families, and on individuals, particularly those who have lost their source of income. We continue to experience the anxiety of illness, of isolation, and uncertainty. We need hope. We need encouragement. We need refreshment. The readings provide some of this for us, I believe, today. I'm going to be using all three readings as part of the message. All three moved me in reflecting on God's extravagant and abundant compassion and mercy, and the blessing and provision of God to meet our spiritual and physical needs for life. In Isaiah 55, we hear a poem which is written by a person whom scholars call Second Isaiah. It forms part of the prophecy in Isaiah 40 to 55 about the period of the Israelite exile to Babylon. This chapter appears to be the triumphant close to the prophecy. It is written for the consolation of Israel. The everlasting covenant once promised to David will be established, and the new exodus from Babylon back to Jerusalem, reminiscent of the way Israel's journey began coming out of Egypt, will take place. The poem opens up with a striking question: is anyone thirsty? An invitation is then extended to come and to drink. It is an invitation that is open to all who hear it, to come and to experience the blessing of a new covenant, a new way of life. And Isaiah goes on and provokes our thought as he asks, why do you spend your money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which does not satisfy? The understood way of life is that one has to have wealth in order to buy the necessities for living: bread, water, wine, milk. This worldview carried through to the idea of receiving spiritual blessings. One needed to have something with which to trade in order to receive spiritual blessing. Good deeds, faithful observance of the law, and upstanding reputation, these would get someone in good standing with God. The invitation in the poem is one of extravagance and abundance. It is an invitation to everyone who would respond to come. And no money is required. In fact, money cannot buy what is being given. It is given freely, but most certainly not cheaply. It is a new covenant, a covenant of unfailing love, a covenant of compassion, mercy, a covenant which will ultimately be fulfilled through Jesus, the Anointed One, the servant of whom Isaiah has previously made mention. And the poet symbolizes the gifts of the new covenant by the figure of food and drink, which give life to all who partake of them. This association of eating and drinking with the covenant is interesting as it correlates with God's provision to Israel after the Exodus while in the wilderness. And as well, it correlates with the day of the Lord, or the celebration of the day of the Lord. And of course, with the celebration of communion. The Gospel of John recounts Jesus speaking of himself as the bread of life, and that anyone who comes to him will never thirst. These symbols of eating and drinking are used metaphorically to remind us in everyday simple experiences of the grace of God and the invitation to have life in its fullest sense, abundantly and extravagantly. As we move to reflect on the gospel reading in Matthew 14, once again we are presented with compassion and abundance. From very little, much is produced. It is not acquired through money or material means. Once again, it is a gift. Jesus, God being present on earth, uses the little which was given, gives thanks for it, and it is shared with the crowds. What is collected afterwards is 12 extra baskets full. There was more than what was needed. There was an abundance of food to satisfy the hunger of the crowd. And this is not an expression of the disciples' faith or even of the crowds. It is a gift which comes from a place of extravagant love and compassion. It is an expression of the nature of Jesus. The first verse in the gospel reading stands out to me. Jesus has withdrawn from people to be alone. And the reason for this is that he had just heard that his cousin and friend, John the Baptist, had been beheaded on the king's command. I can only imagine that he withdraws to grieve, to come to terms with the injustice and the loss of a friend. I don't know about you, but I know I would certainly not be in a place of wanting to engage with large groups of people demanding my attention and demanding me minister to them. I would feel emotionally spent and unable to be compassionate in the way that I need to be. But Jesus, out of his unfailing love, compassion, and mercy for the crowds, welcomes the intrusion, begins teaching and healing, and then makes a way to satisfy not only their spiritual hunger, but also their physical hunger. A commentary on Matthew by Frederick Bruner points out that the feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle in Jesus' ministry present in all four Gospels. And the question is asked, why? And he says, perhaps because it shows so comprehensively how Jesus is equal to all human need, whether spiritual or physical. We then move on to the passage where Paul is writing to the church in Rome, as was read in Romans 9, verse 1 to 5. Paul, who was a staunch Jew and persecuted the people of the way of Jesus, had an encounter with Jesus and his life changed drastically. He chose to follow Jesus and traveled to many cities sharing the gospel, the good news which found him. Paul here expresses anguish at the fact that some of the chosen people of Israel have failed to receive the promise of God, which is found in Jesus Christ. Something that was promised by Isaiah, even in Isaiah, the chapter that we read. But Paul is not angry. He is heartbroken. He is so moved with such compassion and a desire that his fellow Jews may know the surpassing love of God, that he proclaims he would give up his own life, that he would have himself separated from Jesus, so that they may know the surpassing love that is found in Jesus. I believe that this is not something which he can proclaim just on his own accord as who he is, out of someone who he is, but it is something which flows out of him from knowing Jesus, knowing life that he has received in Jesus. Up to this point in his letter, he has expressed some deep theology about salvation, grace, faith, the Spirit bringing life, adoption as children into the family of God, and the unconditional love through Jesus Christ, to name but a few. It is out of this understanding and experience of God's compassion and mercy freely given to him that he is moved to compassion for the chosen people of God according to the Old Testament. So as I looked at these three experiences, or three passages as a whole, and bringing them together, we see a movement from the prophecy of Isaiah about the promise of God to the chosen people, the Israelites in exile, for unfading love and free gift of food and drink which give life. This promise is fulfilled through Jesus Christ, who displays the compassion of God in the teaching, healing, and feeding of the crowd of 5,000. In the passage from Romans, we see the effect of this promise on the life of Paul, a zealous Jew transformed through the compassion of Jesus on his life, who is willing to give up his life that other Jews may know God in the same way. As we continue to face the uncertainty in the world and in our lives at this time, I pray that we would experience the compassion of God and respond to the invitation to come and receive food and drink, life in abundance. I pray as well that as we experience this life, we would be like Paul, becoming people of compassion and mercy, desiring with our every being that others would come to know the love of God and the blessing of knowing God and doing everything we can with what we have to show compassion and mercy. When the disciples approached Jesus to ask what they will do about the crowd and the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus said, "You feed them." And they aptly pointed out that they only had 5 loaves and 2 fish. But they forgot to count Jesus in their assessment. Jesus tells them to bring them to him. And we can learn from this, to bring Jesus everything we have in practical obedience, however insignificant that may seem. And under Jesus' blessing, it can bring help of the most creative kind as we respond to Jesus' invitation to come, to receive food and drink freely, without cost, at least for us. For Jesus has paid the ultimate cost. And so let us come to Jesus for life in abundance, that we may as well be a blessing, and that as we bring our seemingly insignificant practical obedience to Jesus, we may find it being used in a much creative way to bless others. Amen.